Welcome back. Well, today I am joined by Dr. Elena Hetts, and she is with Kaiser Permanente, Orange County. Now, she's a family medicine physician as well as the primary care champion for their Healthy Bones program. Well, Elena, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here, Lisa. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak about this really important topic, especially for our seniors out there.
Well, exactly. And, you know, the subject matter today is osteoporosis. And oftentimes we have absolutely no idea that we have it. And so before we even get into how we would know, can you tell me what osteoporosis is?
Oh, absolutely. So osteoporosis, what that word actually means is porous bone. So if you look at bone under a microscope, it actually sort of looks like a honeycomb. So there's the bone structure with all these holes in it, and those with osteoporosis have lower bone density, so those holes are bigger. And consequently, the bones are more fragile and susceptible to fracture and breakage. And so that's what osteoporosis in a nutshell is. And you made a really good point, Lisa, about us not always knowing whether or not we have it. We actually call osteoporosis a silent disease because many times most people with osteoporosis have no symptoms at all until they actually fall and have a fracture, which of course is very painful. So it's only at that point that we may know. But we do have ways now to screen for osteoporosis.
Right. Yes. In fact, you do bone density screening and things like that. Let me ask you a question in regards to osteoporosis or maybe just the fragility of bones. Can you have osteoporosis as a young person?
Well, if you have, certainly, most osteoporosis increases with age. Our bone density naturally increases with age. But there are some people who are younger who may have lower bone density due to underlying health conditions or medications that they may be taking. So particularly people who take chronic steroids or who are on certain medications for cancer, for example, those things can increase one's risk. There are certain diseases that put us more at risk, like rheumatoid arthritis and HIV and hyperthyroidism. But generally, we start screening when people are a little bit older, unless they have risk factors such as those.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good to know, because I often wondered, I have people who break a lot of bones, but then I've been super fortunate and haven't broken anything. So I didn't know if that really affected anybody one way or the other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's why I asked. Okay. So let's talk about screening. Is it something that is routinely done?
It is routinely done. So basically, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force recommends osteoporosis screening. By screening, we mean taking people who have no symptoms at all and just testing them. So they recommend starting screening for women, definitely age 65, and for men starting at age 70. However, we may start earlier if you have risk factors like those that we had mentioned, and also anyone over the age of 50 who's actually had a fracture so I think you mentioned knowing lots of people who've had fractures. So yes, unless it was, so for example, a fracture sustained with major trauma, like we pretty much expect almost anyone to get a fracture in a high impact car accident, but other types of fractures. So anyone with a fracture over the age of 50 ought to probably get screened for osteoporosis.
Does menopause have anything to do with it?
It does. So in menopause, our production of estrogen decreases. And that's why we start screening women earlier. It's that loss of estrogen that affects our bone metabolism and makes us women more susceptible to decreased bone density as we enter menopause.
Okay. I thought it had something to do with it, primarily because women who do go through menopause at an earlier age than, say, 60 or 65 tend to have the bone density screening. I mean, most people that I know have had that happen. So good. I'm glad I asked that question. So then at what point do you start getting screening, and is it done at the same time as a mammogram?
Oh, okay. So it can be done at the same time as a mammogram, but they are very separate, different types of exams. They're similar, I guess, in that they're both types of X-ray, so one could conceivably schedule them the same day, but it's usually actually different technicians that would perform the exam. The bone density test that is generally done is called a DEXA scan. It's a dual energy X-ray absorptiometry test. So you can see why we shorten it to DEXA, DXA. And so what they do is they send these X-ray beams. Generally, we're measuring the bone density in the spine and the hip, which are the parts of the body that are most likely to sustain serious fracture. And then they compare that bone density. They measure the bone density and compare it to the bone density of say, a healthy 30-year-old. And then in that way determine whether a person's bone density is in what we call osteoporotic range and might necessitate treatment. And the test itself, I just want to say, a lot of people are a little nervous anytime you say they're going to go off and get some sort of diagnostic testing, but it's actually a very easy test to do. And I think it's covered because it's considered a preventive service. It's covered by Medicare. And so there shouldn't really be much of a copay, I don't think, for most people. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't take very long. You make an appointment with the radiology department. You go there, you lie on a padded, surface, it's padded platform, and it doesn't take very long, about 15, maybe 20 minutes, depending on, how difficult it is to get the positioning right, etc. You can remain fully dressed. You don't even have to take anything off as long as you don't have buttons and zippers in the way. That's not a problem at all. And then and sometimes people worry about the amount of radiation they might be exposed to. So I just want to reassure people on that point. It is a very low dose of radiation that's used. In fact, just flying round trip, say, from the West Coast to the East Coast round trip, that is actually 15 to 20 times more radiation than one would get from actually doing one of these little DEXA bone density screens.
Wow. That's a crazy comparison. I had no idea that we were being exposed like that. Oh my gosh. Okay, so let's talk about treating osteoporosis. So once you've found someone that has, the beginning stages of it, what do you provide?
Okay, so there are of course medications for osteoporosis, but before we get to we can get to that, of course. But I think that fall prevention is something that doesn't get enough attention. And this is something that people should be aware of. So there are a lot of things that we can do in our homes to decrease our risk of falling, like taking out throw rugs and things, making sure we have grab handles, making sure the lighting is good in our hallways, maybe using night lights, things like that. And a lot of, I think, many health insurance programs, including ours here at Kaiser, offer fall prevention and balance training classes. So I would encourage everyone to take advantage of those things. If you are a little unsteady, make sure you're using your cane and your walker, because, should a person actually fall and break a hip, it's actually really serious. Unfortunately, about 40% of people who sustain a hip fracture don't ever return back to their pre-fracture level of function. And a good portion end up in nursing homes, after sustaining a fracture like that. And unfortunately, about 20% of people, it's a high mortality rate. About 20% of people actually die within the first year of sustaining a fracture. And it's from complications of the fracture, complications of whatever surgery they need to repair it. So it is a really serious problem. So fall prevention is one thing. Mm-hmm. Other things, of course, eliminating if a person smokes any level of smoking or tobacco exposure. It's important to get rid of that. And I think most health plans, including us, have lots of tobacco cessation programs available. And then alcohol. Limiting alcohol use is also important. So we try to encourage people to limit their alcohol use for men, less than 2 drinks per day, and for women, less than 1 drink per day if possible. So that's one thing. Calcium and vitamin D. You've probably heard a lot about calcium and vitamin D and how much should I take and is it safe to take all that. So with regard to calcium and vitamin D, generally we recommend about 1,200 for people over age 50, we'll just make a sort of a general guideline, a good guideline for the average person over 50, about 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day and 1,000 units, international units, of vitamin D. And when it comes to calcium, there are all kinds of supplements out there, right? You walk into a vitamin shop or a drugstore, there's so many. What do you use?
Right.
How much do you need? That 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day is really from a combination of what one consumes through their diet and supplements. And actually, we absorb better calcium in food rather than calcium in supplements. If you're going to use supplements, we only, you could get those tablets that are, I don't know, up to 600 milligrams per tablet, but we can only really absorb not more than, 500 milligrams at a time. So if you're going to take more than that, you got to split the dose. And then don't take too much, because excessive calcium can lead potentially to kidney stones. And then some people have underlying health conditions in which their doctors may actually recommend even lower doses. So it's important to be aware of that too.
Well, yeah, I was wondering about calcium buildup. I mean, there's calcium buildup in our arteries, and I didn't know if that contributed to it if you're taking too much calcium.
Yeah. So that's why you don't want to take too much, and why it's also better to obtain your calcium through dietary sources. So, so of course, dairy products, most people know about that, but like an 8-ounce cup of non-fat milk is about 300 milligrams of calcium right there. Yeah. Or an ounce and a half of cheese, and like leafy green vegetables, yogurt, those are good. And then orange juice is fortified these days. So it's possible. So if you can focus more on that, less on the supplements. But supplements are out there and very effective.
All those things you mentioned sound great. So I love all that. Now, I was actually going to ask you about the orange juice, because sometimes it says that it has calcium in it. So is that added calcium?
Yes. So they've added the calcium.
Okay.
And similarly, milk is fortified too with vitamin D, which is nice. So there's been a lot of hoopla about vitamin D over the years, yes. And with regard to vitamin D, that's, again, you don't want to take too much of that. The vitamin D tablets, oh my goodness, sometimes people will bring me like 5,000 unit tablets of vitamin D. That's generally too much for the average person. Well, actually, there have been some studies that have found that taking more than 4,000 international units of vitamin D per day actually negatively affects one's bone density. So you want to limit it to maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 if you've got a bone vitamin D deficiency. But vitamin D is actually something that our bodies can produce with sun exposure. And so sometimes, if people don't want to take supplements, it's just as effective to get a little sun exposure, maybe, and it's not enough that it would increase your risk of skin cancer. Of course. We're talking maybe 10 to 30 minutes of sun exposure just of your face and your arms, 3 or 4 times a week is often sufficient. So that's a good option for many people.
Okay, so it's good to know that, some sun exposure is excellent. And of course, here in California, we get plenty of that. So awesome. All right, great. And then what about medication other than the supplements that you mentioned? Is there anything else?
Oh, sure. Yeah. There are lots of medications out there these days for osteoporosis, but our first line medications are what we call the bisphosphonates. And these are medications like Fosamax is a very common one, or Abandronate. These medications are given orally. They can be given daily, weekly, or monthly. And then there's actually an intravenous form of the bisphosphonates. It's given once a year for those who are, for whatever maybe medical conditions, they're unable to tolerate oral medications. Okay. So, and the way those medicines work is they decrease the activity of osteoclasts, which break down the bone and sort of it's sort of a whole bone metabolism is a building up and breaking down bone process. So if you slow down the breakdown of bone, hopefully you'll have more time for it to build up. So, and they are, so there are a lot of options for that. They're very effective at decreasing the risk of fracture. In fact, those who do get treated for osteoporosis with medications cut their risk of fracture in half. Great. So, yeah.
That is great information. And I appreciate you spending the time telling us all about osteoporosis. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
All right. We'll talk to you again.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back after this.